Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to our third webinar in our post-2020 series. We're very excited to have you with us today and thank you for joining. Today we are going to be looking at two sides of one coin, taking up the challenge to address both the global climate and nature crises together most effectively by exploring the linkages between them. We've got some exciting presentations lined up today. Firstly, we will have a presentation by Ingrid Coetzee, and she is our Senior Manager of Biodiversity and Nature-Based Solutions here at ICLEI Africa and in the city's Biodiversity Center. And Ingrid will be presenting an introduction and progress to date on the road to 2020, followed by Yunus Arakan, who's our Head of ICLEI Global Policy and Advocacy. And he will be painting the global picture in terms of the linkages between the biodiversity and climate. After that, we will have some thoughts from Renata Gomez from Regions 4. And she will be sharing some of the outcomes from the Regions 4 Learning Platform event on the same topic, bringing nature and climate together. And then finally, we will have a presentation by Joel Park from TNC. And he'll be presenting on some of TNC's work in the climate and biodiversity space. So before I hand over to Ingrid, I think just to mention that this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be sent to everyone who registered for the webinar. The webinar will also take place again at 3 p.m. South African Standard Time, or GMT+2 this afternoon, in order to accommodate other time zones. And how we will run the webinar is we will go through each of the presentations, and then after that we'll open the floor for discussion and some questions. So please, we ask that you hold your questions until the end, at which point there will be two ways in which you can ask questions. The first is by typing in the chat box, and the second is by raising your hand, and we will unmute you and give you the floor. So a huge thank you again to everyone for joining, and at this point I'm going to hand over to Ingrid.
All right, good day to everybody. So my task is just to introduce and bring everybody up to speed in terms of where things are with the local and subnational government roadmap leading to the CBD COP in China, Kunming, China next year towards the end of 2020. And on your screen you will see a slide which essentially shows the major events just for this year. I have not included the events for next year because I just wanted to hold sort of briefly and see where we are currently. So you will see that there have been a number of really important events already taking place. The regional consultations were in the first quarter of this year, and then the very important 7th assessment report that came out from the IPBES in early May. And now in June, where we are currently, we basically have the Resilient Cities Congress, which is taking place next week in Bonn, and there are going to be quite a few sessions around nature-based solutions, etc. And also 2 weeks ago there was the Nature of Cities Summit, which took place in Paris. Webinar 3 is the one in the block highlighted in red, and the key events leading forward are there's a very important meeting of metropolitan areas taking place in the middle of July in Medellin, Colombia. And this is a gathering of metropolitan governments from all over the world, which has been convened by the Humboldt Institute in Colombia, as well as the Secretariat on the Convention of Biological Diversity and ICLEI as well. And then also in July, earlier in July, there is the the 9th Trondheim Conference on Biodiversity, which is taking place in Trondheim, Norway. And then in August, there is the first meeting of the open-ended intersessional working group of the CBD, which will take place in Nairobi. And this is going to be a really important gathering where all the parties and their stakeholders and partners will get together, and it will be the first major event where there will be opportunity for debate and discussion around the more substantive issues in terms of where we're going to around the new global biodiversity framework that is going to be concluded obviously next year at the China COP. And there are also a series of other events taking place this year. We will continue our webinar series. ICLEI is also working with various role players to develop a action agenda on, or a commitment platform which relates to the action agenda on the Cities with Nature platform. And we've engaged in discussions with a range of experts as well as the SCBD around how that is going to look and how it will operate. It will certainly be on the Cities with Nature platform, and it'll be open for any city to make a commitment, and also a regional or subnational government to make a commitment in terms of what they would like to do and committing themselves and what their ambitions are going forward on the global biodiversity framework. Another major event that has just recently taken place, in fact last week, the Informal Advisory Group on Mainstreaming Biodiversity held its first meeting. This was done electronically on the 13th of June. And that was essentially, that's the group of 30 members, of which 15 are parties or representatives of parties to the CBD. And then there are 15 representatives of organizations and NGOs and communities globally. And ICLEI is very fortunate in that it represents all of local and subnational governments on that body. And in addition to the actual informal advisory group, which advises the executive secretary and the bureau of the CBD on the long-term mainstreaming approach, there is also an extended group of key stakeholders that are also consulted in the whole process. And then just two other things at the TNOC summit, which was held in Paris. There was a session on the 4th of June which looked at specifically post-2020, and it addressed or has come out with a statement called the Common Road Map for Cities, Metropolitan Areas, Local and Subnational Governments Towards Living in Harmony with Nature. And that essentially is a document that was sort of the outcome of that session at the TNOC summit. And finally, just to say that there is already, in terms of the global partnership, there are two advisory committees, the one on subnational government, which is chaired by Regions 4, and the other one on local government or cities, which we are in the process of reactivating because it had become dormant, and we are engaging through our ICLEI political structures as well as with cities, and there will be very soon, within the next couple of weeks, a very important announcement that will be made around this local government advisory committee, which is part of the global partnership. And that, I think, is all that I have to say in summary. Of course, there are a lot of other things that are happening, but those are the major points to highlight. Thank you.
Great. So thank you, Ingrid. I think that is just a snapshot of progress on the roadmap to 2020 to date. And I think without further ado, I will now hand over to Yunus, who is our head of global policy and advocacy at ICLEI. And he's going to be making a few of the critical linkages between the CBD and the UNFCCC on the link between biodiversity and climate. So Yunus, over to you.
Thanks, Timothy. It's really a pleasure to join this community and commend the work of ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Center. And I think it's a really important agenda that we're discussing today, the synergies between the climate process and the biodiversity, especially in the post-2020 framework negotiations. I'm addressing you not only in my capacity as the ICLEI's advocacy head, but also I'm the focal point of local governments and municipal authorities constituency to the UNFCCC. Um, in that sense, it's not necessarily a vision of ICLE, but also the collective activities we're doing, and as such. So in this presentation, I wanted to limit ourselves to how are we engaged in the climate process and what are the cross-cutting issues. I think the after this discussions, there will be a clear with all the participants, other speakers, to map how we will make sure the best out of it, because we're talking about I think more from now on around 18 months of a process that will really be a very intensive process. So let's start with where we are in the Paris Agreement, because the process is particularly different after Paris Agreement, because we all know these are the three Rio Conventions: Legacy of Earth Summit, Biodiversity, Land, and Climate Change. Whereas these three conventions were born out of this Agenda 21. Local Agenda 21 was a chapter. Unfortunately, in the text of the UN Climate Convention, there was no reference even to any stakeholders. And although in the implementation there are constituencies which is representing the 9 majors of the Agenda 21, in official documents there was literally nothing to any of the stakeholders, and that was our advocacy that we started starting from 2007 onwards, when the nations decided to write a new regime under the UN Climate Change Framework Convention. That was at that time Bali Roadmap, that was turned into a Copenhagen Summit. It was always exciting for us, because we said that, well, there's nothing to us in UNFCCC, there's nothing on the Kyoto Protocol, let's make sure the third time the same mistake is not repeated. So that was our vision, that we had all mobilized all our resources. It took a long time, not necessarily from local governments, but the world was having challenges with Copenhagen. During this process, we had used our opportunities as an advocacy through constituency. We had started to be much more actively in the negotiations, the UNFCCC negotiations, and the climate summit in 2014 was a major opportunity for all change of the mindsets. So compared to the UN biodiversity process, where you started with a decision on cities in 2008, then with an action plan of a COP, that is far well advanced than what we have in the climate change. But of course, you all know climate is much more political, much more complicated. So the good news, as we said, in the Paris Agreement 2015, now we have a preamble, which is this is a document that is signed by heads of state. There is a reference to preambular paragraph which says importance of engagement of all levels of government. And this all levels of governments, again, subnational governments or local governments, and different terminologies, it is referred in adaptation, capacity building, loss and damage. In the Paris Agreement, there is another document that is more a COP decision, which is the implementation of this Paris Agreement. There is a clear chapter called non-party stakeholders, and there we are referred as cities and other subnational authorities. Previously, we had the word of governmental stakeholders, but now the wording in the UNFCCC is cities and other subnational authorities. Again, this is different than the terminology used in the biodiversity framework. These are just comparative things, and I think it's helpful for us to understand. There we have much more clear engagement opportunities, and that's what we have been building on over these years. You all, again, another difference is that the climate negotiations are much more intensive, or used to be much more intensive. We don't know how it will evolve in the next couple of years, but one key difference is that in the biodiversity you have it every 2 years, whereas in the climate we have every year. And in every year, the conference of parties is going one part of the world. What we are noticing that we have a consistent, let's say, 3-pronged engagement, and then we have priorities for each year. The difference is that there is certain styles that doesn't change too much, but every COP, because of the priorities of the host city or country, and the political priorities of the process of that specific year, we have to change our, or let's just fine tune our priorities. In every year, what we do is that, first of all, we showcase our information about what local and regional governments are doing on climate change, because we know that this is independent from what decisions comes out. This is mainly through our data reporting platforms. ICLEI had been running the carbon climate registry and since 2010, and this year we have merged it with CDP, so it is a CDP and ICLEI joint reporting platform, which will be feeding into the UN climate reporting platform as well. Then we have our own side events, summits, the one similar to what you have in the regularly global summit of local and subnational governments. In our case, the terminology may be different, the format can be different, but we definitely have side events and summits. Then we participate in the consultations, there are workshops, we are invited as a constituency, and there is a new initiative called Marrakesh Partnership, which is a bit more action oriented. And then we participate in the decision making, we submit documents, the agenda items, we make interventions, and we use effectively the national government's delegations through the Friends of Cities, and you are familiar with that, both climate change and biodiversity, and of all other multilateral environmental agreements. It is a party-driven process. Therefore, the final input to the text should come from the parties. And in that sense, we would like to use with those friendly countries, and this is also expanding now. There is more and more recognition of urban and climate community. This year in Chile, we will be in December. We will be focusing on the NDC, the nationally determined contributions, which is the climate strategies of national governments. There is a discussion on local climate finance, and we will continue to raise our ambition because of the urgency and climate emergency now coming up, and the pathway to climate neutrality. We should be focusing on it much more clearly. I'm showing this is the priorities of the presidency of the COP, which will be held by Chile, which is a Latin American country. As you can see, they have mapped 7 areas, and one of them is biodiversity. This is, of course, an extreme opportunity, which has not been the case before. There has not been that much emphasis to biodiversity by any presidency so far. So this, of course, follows the global recognition of biodiversity framework. This means we could expect much more concrete outcomes from the biodiversity, from the climate COP this year. That is exciting us, of course. Once again, every year it's an intensive cycle, 12 months compared to 24 months. It is led by the presidency, the previous COP, and then the next one. Here you have the leaderships, but in the middle of it is the mid-year, the consultations in Bonn. That is again a difference. There is wherever the COP goes, they always come back to Bonn to have a mid-year assessment and review, and that's where ICLEI is importantly actively involved, because we are based in Bonn. Mayor of Bonn is president of Bonn, president of ICLEI, and we have a strong relation with the secretariat as well, and you will see a couple of more updates on that. Over these years, the thing that has changed a lot is that we had Talanoa dialogues as a legacy of the COP hosted in Bonn in 2017. In 2018, especially, this was an opportunity because for the first time, the climate targets were discussed by civil society or stakeholders. This was a mandate from the COP, and it was again our success of advocacy, because original plan was that dialogues would be held only once and it will be held only at COP. Now it is, I mean, throughout the year it was held everywhere in the world, because the proposal that was adopted was changed because of our inputs as well, that it will be held every city at every local and subnational region. So we had, as cities and regions, 60 sessions in 40 countries. And some of them was really very ambitious in terms of the collaboration with the national governments. Africa shined up, having the most of them, and this was the first time to bring Paris Agreement home, how to make the NDCs fit for Paris Agreement. And that is an opportunity, because this process has led to a new decision saying that, okay, use this experience to improve your NDCs. That is the biggest achievement we had over the past years. The key agenda, how we are now running it, is this year will be our engagement through LGMA. May, June was very heavy. There is UNFCCC process, which to this month is particularly important, but that there's other UN processes. And as you have seen in 2020, we mapped biodiversity as well. But meanwhile, we also have the COP of the land degradation in India in September. So from now until 2020 biodiversity COP, it will be a couple of series of 3 COPs, or let's say there will be 4 COPs of 3 conventions of Rio. This is important. These are the land COP in India, the climate COPs in Chile and possibly in the UK, and the China COP of biodiversity. This gives a huge opportunity for us to make the inputs and outputs from each of those helping each other, so that by the end of 2020 we can come up with a much more meaningful things. Of course, the one of the interesting things is the Climate Action Summit that will be held this year. And this is important because this is also having a work stream on nature-based solutions. This is again that we have highlighted in Sharm el-Sheikh. That is an opportunity for the nature community, and I think it's resonating a lot. But we have to be actively involved because the process is not very easy. Both the biodiversity community and the climate community of local and regional should be actively engaged. And that should be one of the priorities, how to map this in the next couple of days. A couple of outcomes from again climate community. City of Bonn is implementing an interesting project called Beethoven Pastoral. The logic is that Beethoven has composed an important symphony, pastoral symphony. That is, of course, Beethoven is well known with his 9th symphony, which is an invitation for peace, universal peace. But pastoral is also a peace between man and nature. So Climate Change Secretariat and City of Bonn has kicked off this in 2017. But the goal is to have between Earth Day 2020 and the Environment Day 2020, from April to June, series of concerts or cultural events worldwide that highlights the value of nature. What we are saying is that ICLEI is now joining this process, and we would like to bring this as an awareness raising to post-2020 biodiversity process as well, because we know there is a difficulty, there is a challenge that biodiversity community is suffering, that it is not getting the right attraction in terms of awareness and visibility. So this could be a good opportunity that brings climate and biodiversity process again. Last slide, as mentioned, resident cities, we will have the IPES global assessment, one of the co-chairs addressing the closing plenary, and this would be an opportunity for us to advance further. And here in Bonn, there will be a very important high-level event, and we will kick off the debate to a new phase. And from Friends of Cities, we are going to Friends of Multi-Level Action. That is much more meaningful because we have understood that there is now a better recognition for collaborative action, and we hope this would also support our work along these lines. So this is the end of my presentation. In the PowerPoint, you would see links to our previous webinars. We are also having monthly webinars. The latest document report, the key decision from Katowice as a background information. But I think with this input, I can conclude my presentation so that we can have a discussion from this webinar on, but probably more importantly after this webinar, when everybody now gets together their ideas and insights, then we can come up, and I think Cities by their sense of ICLEI would lead this process on the way forward. So I thank you a lot for your patience and interest.
Okay, so thanks, Yunus, and I think that was useful in painting a sort of global picture of what is happening. And I hope for everyone in attendance that was that has given the sort of background needed for the 2 presentations to follow. So next up, I'm mindful of the time. So next up, we have from Regions 4, Regions for Sustainable Development, and they've recently rebranded, and this is their new logo you can see on your screens now. And we're excited to have Renata Gomez with us, and she is going to take us through some of the work that Regions 4 is doing in this space. So Renata, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, team, for the invitation, and I thank ICLEI also for these very, very insightful webinars on the road to COP15. There are certainly very useful and great for preparing our constituencies for what is to come after after 2020. Next slide, please. Thank you. As Tim said, my name is Renata Gomez. I'm with Regions 4. I'm the policy officer of biodiversity. And I would like to talk to you about the opportunities that we have within Regions 4 and that we coordinate and that we lead within the Convention on Biological Diversity for subnational governments, mainly just regions. Yeah, so first of all, I would like to put you in context. So Regions 4, we coordinate the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments to the CBD, the same as Ingrid just mentioned that their Advisory Committee on Cities is coordinated by ICLEI and is part of a global partnership in which both advisory committees are part and contribute to. We also host a learning platform called the Regions for Biodiversity Learning Platform, which is an online community of 12 regional governments who exchange information and lessons learned and find ways to come up with solutions to common challenges together, and then work to present these solutions in a format that is somehow useful to the parties to the CBD when taking decisions at COPs or at SBSTA or at other global events that are important. So basically this is the framework. Next slide, please. Our framework of action. So yes, so the advisory committee, as I was mentioning, advocates for regional governments at the heart of the CBD. We promote dialogues with among the advisory committee members and the parties to the CBD. Actually, only last year we held side event at the previous SBSTA 22, in which some of the parties of the members of the advisory committee, mainly it was Mexico, Korea, Japan, Canada, were present and exchanging thoughts and information and dialoguing with the regions that were presenting, like I said, well, lessons learned. In that particular case, it was on actions on biodiversity towards the fulfillment of the Aichi biodiversity targets. And it was very interesting to see how these how we can interact with the parties and influence their decisions. We also strengthen partnerships to support subnational actions on the ground and empower the leadership of the advisory committee members by making them collaborate and exchange information, especially on technical capacities and technical information from north to south, south, and so on. So yes, the same way as Yunus was presenting the upcoming opportunities on the UNFCCC framework of action, and same way as Ingrid was mentioning these key events throughout the year, I would like to mention or highlight the Trondheim conferences on biodiversity that are taking place in July in Norway. We, the advisory committee, are having a presence there and are presenting our ideas and our thoughts to the parties of the convention there. Also, we are actively participating at the open-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework meeting that is taking place straight after the Trondheim conference in August in Kenya. And of course, we are going to be at the next SBSTA in November this year in Montreal. We are hosting a side event at the SBSTA, and more information is to come on our website, of course. And so yeah, so the idea is to present, like I was saying, our main messages from the regional governments that are part of the advisory committee to the parties in the hopes of influencing their decisions and informing them of what is happening on the ground when it comes to mainstreaming biodiversity especially into climate change policies, because climate change policies are fundamental. As Yunus was saying, it's a lot more political. Their conversations, the conversations held at these forums are a lot more active and popular to the world. And we would like to, as the executive secretary of the CBD was mentioning on the previous COP, and she keeps saying this on her public statements, that biodiversity is essential to human life. In the same way as we can work in biodiversity, we can do that with climate change, and linking these two agendas is only logic, and it's the intelligent next step to do so. Particularly at the SUBSTA, we are presenting a report on mainstreaming biodiversity in practice. So it's not a collection of cases, but rather a report. And if you can show me next slide, I can get into a little bit more detail of the report. Thank you. So the report hopes to identify capacity building and training needs for mainstreaming biodiversity, opportunities to develop partnerships with the private sector, indigenous peoples and local communities, and other stakeholders, mechanisms to monitor implementation of mainstream biodiversity policies on the ground at the subnational level or regional level, and obstacles that block mainstreaming of biodiversity, again, at the regional level. So we have just launched a questionnaire that will gather, that will collect information for us to complete these chapters of the report that we intend to bring to SUBSTA. So it is open, of course, to all advisory committee members, but again, it's also open to subnational leading regions willing to make an input to the CBD through the advisory committee. So even outside regions can join and are very much invited to find out more on what we're doing and how you can contribute. As I was saying, next slide, the report will contain some practical cases, although it's not going to be a collection of cases. Quebec's biodiversity monitoring network is actually going to be one of the actions or initiatives that is going to be part of this report, because it's a very clever way to integrate biodiversity into climate change actions and programs. So, and this is what Tim was saying when he introduced me. That is one of the outcomes of the webinar session that we held within the learning platform that we host. This learning platform is closed only for members, but again, regions are welcome to join if they wish to do so, though it will have to be through membership. But anyway, so the very big takes that we get from this lesson learned from Quebec, or this good practice, is that they managed to create a task force among the Ministry of Forest, Wildlife and Parks with the Ministry of the Environment and the fight against climate change. So these two ministries created this task force to implement a monitoring network with the objective to identify changes in ecosystems that will later support decision-making processes. So this pilot project started in 2016 with testing 20 sites in Quebec. So they selected these biodiversity important sites throughout Quebec in order to, of course, ensure accessibility for everyone. They also integrated existing monitoring systems in protected areas into this selection of sites. So they were not just working in silos, they were working in a coherent manner with what has been done already, and they were building up on that. And they then selected and developed biological indicators that responded to these fast changes in different environments, and the different environments were including forest, tundra, wetlands, and aquatic environments. But what is interesting about this pilot project, which is now working in the last year, 2018, if I'm not wrong, they worked in over 50 different sites throughout Quebec, and they were involving, and next slide, please, they were involving local communities and indigenous peoples. In particular, they were working with the Inuit community, and they developed a partnership in the Nunavik parks, for example, with the Inuit communities, and this also allowed not only for the monitoring of sites really far north in the region that were inaccessible to people who aren't from the area, but it also created conscience on the local communities on the importance of course, their biodiversity, but monitoring it to support better decision making in the future, especially when it comes to climate change and these drastic temperature changes. So yes, these kind of partnerships, these kind of good practices, and these kind of good and innovative implementation actions on the ground are the ones that we share amongst each other within the advisory committee and within the learning platform hosted in Regions 4. So it's a good way of engaging, and it's a very practical way of contributing to the CBD processes and consultation activities that are taking place throughout the year, and that will continue to take place in the following years. So yes, I hope I made my point in highlighting these very practical and useful ways of contributing and sending your inputs to the CBD. In the next slide, you have my contact information so please feel free to reach out. Also, our website is regionforce.org. It's very simple. So please feel free to contact us for further information. Thank you, team.
Great. Thank you, Renata, for that. That was great. And I think some very practical examples there that were very useful to share, especially around Quebec and the biodiversity monitoring network. So thank you for that. And as Renata's highlighted, there's many opportunities there to get involved. And we will share this presentation with you after the webinar for you to have everyone's contact details as well. So without further ado, I'm mindful of time and wanting to get to if there are any questions at the end. But we're very excited to have Joel with us from the Nature Conservancy. They are one of our founding partners on the Cities with Nature Partnership Initiative. And Joel is joining us today to chat through some of the work that they're doing in this space. So Joel, it's great to have you, and over to you.
Great, thanks, Tim. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. I'm Joel Paik, as Tim said, from the Nature Conservancy. If you know us, you probably know us as a fairly traditional biodiversity conservation organization working around the world on sort of traditional protection and conservation. But we actually do much more than that, including in the climate policy and advocacy realm, and increasingly in the cities space. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we see these two bodies of work coming together at a fairly high level, and give one quick example from on the ground. This picture I just like because I think when you're talking about climate change and biodiversity, having power lines that have been built cutting directly through a 75-year-old tree kind of sums up the challenge pretty neatly, even without context. But Tim, if you want to go to the first slide here. So we really do view the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis as completely intertwined. We as a world cannot get to 1.5 degrees without nature, from just the carbon sequestration value of our of biodiversity, of intact tropical forests, of soil carbon, and changes that we need to see in farming practices, and blue carbon, mangroves and other ocean systems that store carbon. And so we really do view nature as being able to solve, about a third of the necessary GHG reductions that we need to be on path to that 1.5 degree target. And there's viable solutions across a range of ecosystems, as I mentioned, sort of traditional conservation in tropical forests, much more efficient forestry and food and ag systems especially. Restoration is a huge opportunity for climate sequestration. Getting zero deforestation supply chains, there's been a lot of good commitments made, not as much action, and so I'll talk about how we're trying to move those commitments into action. As I mentioned, blue carbon, a lot of interconnections there, both with climate mitigation, but also adaptation and resilience. And then just some lifestyle changes in terms of food source and other waste that we see from people's consumption patterns. So opportunities across a range of sectors to see better, less carbon intensive development across the globe. So we were part of launching the Nature for Climate Coalition. Nature for Climate exists to promote action across all those sectors around natural climate solutions, and has targeted the UN process as well as private sector actors to take action. You can see here some of the groups involved in the coalition. There's came together about a year and a half ago, and has been present in many of those same forums we've heard the other speakers talk about today. And as I mentioned, we're looking at this as a coalition that wants to impact action across all sectors, from policymakers in the UN system and how we get nature and natural climate solutions into NDCs and in all the various frameworks that stem from the UN system, but also private corporations. As I said, good commitments. Now the real challenge is how do we turn private sector commitments into action around zero deforestation supply chains and other sectors there. Investors we see as a case where we can show a high return on investment or higher return on investment for less carbon intensive practices, and it's something that there's been a lot of traction on as people begin to actually price climate risks into into their investments. And then civil society, we also want to make sure that that natural climate solutions involve the right and appropriate social safeguards, involve voices for subnational actors, why we work closely with our colleagues at ICLE, with indigenous groups, and we work closely with several coalitions on that front. So we want this to be seen as something that is an active and engaged with civil society. And so how this comes together with our work in cities. So if we have how biodiversity and climate are interlinked, our work in cities at the Nature Conservancy involves looking at how cities, not as a necessarily as a threat to sustainable development and to climate action, but as a huge opportunity. As we all know, we're entering or have entered the urban century. And so this report that came out last fall, the Conservancy with a host of partners, including ICLE, Future Earth, Stockholm Resilience Center, the Natural Capital Symposium, and others, amongst many others, looked to try to really answer several questions around cities and biodiversity and climate change. So how much global habitat will be impacted from urban growth and where that impact will occur? What fraction of the world's protected areas will potentially be impacted from urbanization? What are the carbon emissions that will occur related to urban expansion into natural areas? And what are some solutions that cities can use to help manage their own growth? And some of the findings, we are building basically a city with the population of London every 7 weeks, and will urbanize a space larger than the country of Colombia by mid-century. So if you push together all the new city cities that'll be built. It'll be the size of the entire nation of Colombia. And this report looked a little bit backwards to say, well, can we see how much urbanization has impacted biodiversity previously, and found from 1992 to 2000, about 190,000 square kilometers of natural habitat was lost from urbanization. But from 2000 to 2030, urban growth could threaten 290,000 square kilometers of natural habitat. So a real increase in the pressures that urbanization is putting on biodiversity, as well as carbon storage. Urban growth projections currently would destroy habitat that stores an estimated 4.35 billion metric tons of carbon. That's the equivalent of just under 1 billion cars a year on the road. And then from an adaptation standpoint as well was one of the areas we looked at, and we found that by 2030, urban areas forecast to more than double, 23,000 square kilometers in low-lying coastal zones where a current natural habitat or natural asset is playing a critical role in reducing coastal hazards. So almost 25,000 square kilometers of cities that will be built in an area that they probably are not accounting for the resilience dividend, the resilience benefit of a natural asset. And so we want to help cities appreciate that as they grow, so they can direct the growth to not impact that resilience asset the same way they would account for a seawall or other built asset. So what does this look like on the ground? If you go to the next slide, Tim. Melbourne, Australia, just a week ago, 2 weeks ago now, launched their Living Melbourne urban forest management plan. If you just Google Living Melbourne, you can find that report. So Melbourne is on pace to double its population by mid-century, moving from just over 4 million to about 8 million residents. And a lot of that is expanding into currently undeveloped areas, so it's sprawling quite badly. But Melbourne, I think, as everyone is kind of aware, takes huge pride in being one of, if not the greenest city on earth. Very forward thinking on these issues, and so they wanted to address this impact on biodiversity and habitat while also solving some other problems. And so the Living Melbourne report or Greenprint is an urban forest management plan that looks at where Melbourne has the most opportunity to protect or restore its urban forest canopy for both biodiversity and for people. From a biodiversity standpoint, obviously protecting and restoring forests is great for habitat. Melbourne has between 300 and 400 species of songbirds that live within the metropolitan area. So it's habitat for meaningful biodiversity, we're not just talking about street trees here. But also they wanted to look at how that forest cover can help manage heat stress. They're on yesterday. Last year they had several days close to 47 degrees Celsius, and they are projected to go to over 40 days a year over 40 degrees Celsius in the near future. So next slide, Tim. So the Nature Conservancy, with several partners, both local and other global partners, put together this Living Melbourne plan, which again helps to guide, is intended to help guide decisions about where investments can be made in that urban tree canopy to help solve those dual pain points of biodiversity loss and climate adaptation due to heat stress. So this is a methodology and an approach that we're working with cities around the world, and including with our partners at ICLEI to help promote. And it looks a bit different in every city because we're trying to solve different problems. But the overall approach is, how can we help cities move nature from an amenity, from a parks and rec, a nice to have, into infrastructure, and so they think about it and finance it and support it in the same way they do traffic signals and fire hydrants and roads and whatnot. And so this leads us to work both on green infrastructure in city centers, helping to manage, as I said, heat stress, stormwater flooding through rain gardens and bioswales, so kind of in the urban core, but also as they plan their growth. We know there will be urban expansion, as I mentioned, but we hope to help them plan it around some of those natural assets, accounting for those climate benefits and biodiversity benefits, to try to shape that urban growth, to minimize that impact as much as possible. I'd encourage you to look up both of those reports, Nature and the Urban Century, and the Living Melbourne report, to learn more about the work on the ground. And I'd be happy to follow up with anyone who has more specific questions.
Great, thank you so much, Joel. That was certainly very useful. And I think the reports that Joel has mentioned, we will certainly attach when we send the recording of the webinar. And we are excited as Cities with Nature is actually an implementing partner on the Living Melbourne framework. So yeah, so thanks, Joel. That was a really great input. So at this point, we don't have much time, but if there is anyone on the call, firstly, let me thank all of our presenters. It's been wonderful inputs, and I think certainly the interlinkages between climate and biodiversity and the crises that they both present are undeniable. And as we move towards 2020 and the critical moment for nature, so thank you to everyone who's presented. And at this point, we'll open it up to the floor if there's any questions or points for discussion. As I mentioned before, you can either write in the questions box or you can raise your hand and we will unmute you. So anyone have any questions? Okay, so it doesn't look like there are any questions. So I think I'll just ask any of the presenters if there are any final inputs or any comments on each other's presentations. Any final words from any of the presenters?
Can I take just one moment?
Yes, absolutely. Go for it,
Joel and Renata, thank you a lot for your input. My question goes to Joel. The Nature for Climate, there was the linkage we had with our collaboration with WCST at COP24. We had a session at, we are having a regular low emission solutions conference, and nature-based solutions was also one of the themes last year. And we're hoping to advance this towards Chile as well. I think that could be an interesting area because Cities with Nature is the initiative of ICLEI and the Nature Conservancy and the IUCN, and I see Nature for Climate, where the Nature Conservancy and IUCN are again partner of it, but this time with the business community. So I think we may be considering to see what synergies can be created. And as I said, this is the first effort to have all the partners with NRG Forestry colleagues and the Nature Conservancy. I think the important thing is what will we do from now until or in the next phase. So it would be very important to start to map this. Do we want to have a new merging or coalition, or how to inform climate community much better? And of course, as I said, there are strengths and weaknesses from both sides. There are several things that the biodiversity process has, but there are several things that the climate process has. I think we should be innovative and we should be thinking out of the box and make the better use of the next couple of months. So that's my input, but as I said, this is just the beginning, I guess.
Yeah, and Eunice, if I know you're based in Bonn, some of my colleagues who work much closer on that coalition are there this week and next for the substa meetings, and I'll be there next week.
Oh, fantastic.
For the ICLEI meeting. So let's be in touch offline, and perhaps you can meet up with some of those folks who work closer on that coalition, and certainly I can look for you next week when I'm there to discuss more.
Perfect. That sounds great.
Great. Any other final words of closing from any of the presenters? Otherwise, I think
thanks to ICLEI for hosting and bringing this together and being the glue amongst all of us working at this subnational space in this sometimes complicated national government focused world.
Yeah.
No, thanks, Joel. That's, you know, we've really appreciated having all of you on the webinar today, and thank you to all the attendees who've joined us. We will share all of the information presented in this webinar as well as the recording itself, and we will be repeating the webinar, as I mentioned, at 3 p.m. South African Standard Time, or GMT +2. So I think thank you very much to everyone, and with that, we will close the webinar.